Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Native American cultures of North America in this particular set of lecture videos. Let me make this a little bigger here. So we're going to start off talking about, North America, United States and Canada. The indigenous culture in this area dates back to as far as 12,000 years ago, although the majority of the objects found date from the last 2,000 years. The territory of North America is kind of split into cultural regions just because there's so much varied geographical area here. So basically language, shared language, and social and artistic patterns is how they kind of split it up into different cultures. Lifestyles did vary quite a bit over the North American landscape. Small bands of migratory hunters, and then there are some urban agriculturalists that have settled areas as well. The Yupik and Inuit of Alaska and Canada, also called Eskimo or First Nation people of Alaska, they hunted and fished across, the Arctic from Greenland to Siberia. The maize farmers of American Southwest, down in this area, they built these effective, impressive irrigation systems, roads, and cliff dwellings. And then farmers who settled in the temperate eastern woodlands, they had, a range from Canada to Florida, and from the Atlantic to the Great Plains of the west of the Mississippi. So pretty big area there. They were known for building great earthen mounds that were typically burial places for their elite. So here's the map. The Eskimo peoples are thought to have been brought over by the Bering Strait during the end of the last ice age, between 15,000 and 12,000 BCE. So they were typically sea mammal hunters in the beginning. They did make, tools, obviously, and that culture began around 500 CE in Alaska. So let's move on. Next slide. So we'll talk about the Eskimoan peoples. Like I said, they came across the Bering Strait, and we will talk about this burial mask found at the site of Point Hope. It's an Epi-Utak site, and it's got a lot of burial goods and tools, but this is a burial mask made of ivory from the walrus, and this is a really common material used by Arctic artists because of the scarcity of wood in that region. There's no trees that grow there typically because it's too cold, so they used walrus ivory. There's definitely like 9 different parts to this certain mask here. Several faces, both human and animals, can be found, which kind of is a composite creature that we've seen before in ancient American art. Also, there's a bit of a transformation theme noted, so similar to what we've seen in other ancient American cultures. There's a shallow relief kind of carved in to this. Abstract circles, curved lines are kind of all around this mask. And it's common to see this in a lot of those tools that were found at this certain place from Point Hope in Alaska. They also carved human and animal figurines. They are typically, when it comes to these nomadic peoples, very small scale because they needed portable objects that they could take with them. They couldn't have heavy objects that they would take with them. So typically smaller scale objects from these particular peoples. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We'll talk about the Woodlands. The early Native American artists in the Woodlands excelled in working in stone. They made utilitarian and ceremonial objects. These, people were east of the Mississippi River. They had, large urban centers with populations sometimes exceeding as much as 20,000 in some of these areas. So we'll talk about the Adena culture. They're from Ohio. There's about 500 sites in Ohio in the central woodland area of Ohio. And at some of these sites, there are earthen mounds where they buried the elite. And they found these ceremonial pipes in the graves of the elite in these earthen mounds. They were used to smoke tobacco, which was a very important social and religious ritual by a lot of Native American cultures. Definitely treasured status symbols that men wanted to take with them into the afterlife. This Adena pipe shown here was found in 1901 in the Adena mound next to the body of an adult male. He also had some spear points and beads with him. They think it was carved around 500 BCE at the end of the millennium, and it takes shape of, like the standing man, kind of a generic representation and not really a portrait of the deceased. But he does have some flexed leg poses, some naturalistic joints, kind of with this alert facial expression. His costume, what he's wearing, and then his ears kind of remind us of some of the South American art that we found, and some of the Mesoamerican, such as the Aztec and Maya. Very similar in style, actually, to Mesoamerican sculptures. So that's kind of interesting that they have a similar style to a culture that's actually fairly far away from them. Okay, so we'll move from the Adena, which were an earlier people who started making those mounds first as tombs. We'll move on from them to the Mississippian culture, which emerged around 800 CE. But they were a little later. They encompassed much of the eastern United States, and they got bigger, and their communities were more complex than the Adena. And the mound site, Cahokia in southern Illinois, was the largest city in North America in the early second millennium CE. So around 1050 to 1200, the Cahokia settlement was around 6 square miles and 15 to 20,000 inhabitants, which is large, very large. And another 10,000 people probably lived around the settlement in the countryside. They found approximately 120 mounds at Cahokia. So we'll talk about Monk's Mound here. From between 900 and 1200 CE. It was built in stages, so probably started around 900 and then, ending around 1200. It aligns with the position of the sun at the equinoxes, and they think because of that it might have been an astronomical observatory, as well as maybe a site for agricultural ceremony. And at each stage of the building throughout the years, from 900 to 1200 CE, they think that there was a timber structure on top that would have been destroyed and then built over in the next stage. So they found evidence of timber structures along the stages of this being built. The Mississippians are also known for effigy mounds, which are basically mounds built in the form of animals like birds, serpents, and actually there is a serpent mound that we will talk about next, built by the Mississippian in Ohio. 1070 is the date on that. It's about a quarter-mile long from its open, gaping mouth, which seems to kind of grasp a round object, to its tail, which is coiled at the end here. It was excavated in the 1880s. It was one of the first sites that excavators tried to preserve, because a lot of times pot hunters or farmers would have just plowed over this. So it was preserved, one of the first sites in North America that was preserved. A lot of people that first discovered this thought that this was the Adena culture, but radiocarbon dates, told us that actually this is much later than the Adena. It's the Mississippian that built this. So it does not have any evidence of burials or temples, but they do think that the serpent was important to Mississippian iconography. It appears in a lot of their art, such as, you know, their gorgets, which they wore on necklaces. Basically, they're kind of like a medallion. And they think that it's associated with, you know, the snakes with earth and the fertility of crops. They did find a stone figurine at one Mississippian site that depicts a woman digging her hoe into a serpentine creature that in its tail is basically a vine of gourds. So they do think that the serpent is tied into fertility and agriculture and that kind of thing. So that could be the possible meaning for the construction of the serpent mound. But since it's from 1070, they also, you know, experts believe this could be built because around the same time Halley's Comet came through in 1066, which was an astronomical event that was actually recorded on an 11th century tapestry. And it was thought of as an important omen, and so scholars are thinking that maybe the serpent mound was built in response to that same comet, Halley's Comet, coming and lighting up the sky in North American heavens during that time, and this was built in response to that, potentially. We're not quite sure. It also could be tied into the iconography of the snake and fertility, that kind of thing. So we're not quite sure. It's a bit of a controversy. But it was definitely built by a large labor force, probably under a powerful elite figure. So, so not only did they build these large objects, the Mississippian also built smaller objects, such as this incised gorget with a running warrior from Tennessee, Sumner County, 1250 to 1300 CE. It's made out of shell. It's 4 inches wide. So it's definitely this running warrior in a composite profile. So he's got a profile head and a frontal body, and then once again into profile legs. So it's kind of a mixture of a composite profile, much like the Egyptians did, honestly. And it does, the way he is dressed does resemble some of the Mesoamerican sculptures that we found as well. The bent arms and legs are used to suggest motion typically. He also has an arrow, I believe, in his headdress. He's got a mace in one of his hands, a severed human head in the other. He does have a forked eye falcon painted on his face. That's what that is. And this is a gorget, or basically a necklace medallion, from a burial of temple mounds. They think that these were gifts to the dead to ensure their safe arrival, and also to ensure that they have prosperity in the land of the spirits. They may have been also status symbols while the person was alive, something that they wore as a status symbol, and then they took it with them into their death. So other art objects found in a similar context as this one, you know, in a mound next to a body, include fine mica and embossed copper cutouts of hands, bodies, snakes, birds, other symbolic forms that were buried with the dead. So we'll talk about the Southwest cultures of Native America. They produced a lot of pottery in the late 1st millennium BCE, but the most impressive pottery dates to a later date of 1000 CE. The Mimbres culture of southern New Mexico was one of the cultures that we'll go over. They were around 1000 to 1200 CE, and they made these black on white painted bowls. But we'll talk about this bowl and the Mimbres culture a little bit more in the next video.